Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week at the Better Events podcast. This is Mary Davidson, one of your co hosts. And in today's episode, we have a wonderful guest named Tony, who is a wonderful AV partner that I have had the opportunity to work with. And Tony is going to share practical ways to keep AV costs down. And so we're excited to share this episode with you. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Logan Clements, and I'm joined by fellow co-host Mary Davidson. And you know I love production. You know I love AV. So I'm so thrilled for this guest that we're having on for this week's podcast. And so I'm going to save as much time as we can for our conversation with him. Mary, would you like to introduce Tony to our listeners?
I would love to. So, Tony Gavilanes opened an AV company 19 years ago and developed it to a national footprint. Now managing production for some of the country's largest brands, Tony brings a wealth of creative consultant and project manager experience to his programs. The thing that defines his work is a relationship built on trust. And I have to say, Tony, this is true because we work together. And so I'll just kudos to your bio. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, many more years of a story that is being written. That's pretty much it.
I love that. You can add that to your bio too. That's a good or like your LinkedIn.
Not arrived yet, right?
Yeah.
That's how we're still learning. I think that's the name of the game.
I love it. Well, Tony, we love to always tell our listeners why we asked you here. And listeners, if you were at the Better Events Conference in 2023, you might already recognize Tony's face or voice if you're just listening to us. He was one of our amazing speakers that we had where we dove a little bit more into AV and production. He's a proud member of our Seattle event community, so we see him a lot at different events around town. And Mary has had the pleasure of working with him. I have not yet, but I know he's one of my go-to recommendations for folks looking for robust production services here in Seattle and beyond. So thank you, Tony. We appreciate you being here. And I feel like you said the story has yet to finish. So why don't you first tell us how you got started in the event industry?
Oh yeah, that's great. That's the fun part. I've actually practiced that one. I'm a musician, and so my dad had a grand piano in the house. I took some lessons, but hated them as a kid. I was always like a play by ear kind of just type of guy, an artist, true artist, so to speak. And so when I got into college, my senior project that I self designed was to open a record label because I really wanted to be a business person. I found myself being a very poor employee for a number of different jobs. And so setting out on my own was probably the right vocation for me. And through that process, I developed a record and realized that I really just didn't want to sell my soul for music and, kind of make money for that kind of element of my creativity. And so moved over to producing concerts. And in the meantime, I was working for the University Tech crew and freelancing for a number of other companies. But very slowly found that even though I was still in music, there wasn't really a lot of economy in that. So I found out that businesses pay better than bands with events, and hence corporate AV. So that's been my route. And good old long 19 years of all of that, which is kind of wild to think of at this point.
That's awesome. Tony, are you still a musician? Do you still practice that?
Yes, actually, this very last weekend, I had a few friends over and we had a jam session out on the back porch and a barbecue and everything. It's not often, but yes, my main instrument is drums, but I also play guitars, bass, keyboards. I have a steel drum, pan flutes, accordion, like lots of random.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
So yeah, I'm a clown also, in case you didn't know. So I can basically get out there like a Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins with, the bass drum and all the other things attached to him. Yeah. Which is kind of similar to my professional life, just sans the instruments.
Yeah. That's actually a great transition because we would love for you to share your role at Tech Event Pro and how that relates to AV and events. So talk about what you do, your team, and like what you specifically do yourself as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think it's interesting to kind of transition in that way because I realize how much of my story is wrapped around performing, and I think that I've always been a performer since I was a kid and wanted to try to find the right stage for it. And so, in that frame, I think that ultimately, my title was always executive producer at the company. That was kind of the business card that I designed right when I started the company. I was the executive producer, and people would be like, "You're the executive producer," but that was the idea: is that I would build teams, and I would be the one to coordinate and execute all the complex technicalities that kind of go into the technology for events. But being able to really put together not only that kind of creative element, but also the practical element of the team building and the nuts and bolts of kind of all of that. So yeah, my path from music led from audio initially as an audio technician into the disciplines of video. I started seeing, well, there's projectors out here, there's screens, there's slide decks. How can I get myself into that side of the pool? And then I got, bored, maybe tired, maybe, and then moved into lighting. Learned a little bit of that, enough to be dangerous. Kind of branched into scenic, got into content curation, show design, ultimately project management, and then finally production management, which is kind of where I find myself today.
Ooh, that is, I mean, that's a wealth of knowledge that you got there as a background. Production is always, I think there's so many moving pieces, and yet it is so helpful that you have that experience in each and every element.
Before we continue, here's a word from our sponsors. Richmond, BC is where Canada's iconic coastal lifestyle is infused with Pacific sensibilities, a place that is real, raw, and unvarnished. Less than 25 minutes to downtown Vancouver, Richmond is home to over 20 major hotel brands, most offering free round trip shuttle services to the award winning Vancouver International Airport. Logan and I visited in the spring, and we loved the diverse experiences Richmond offers, from whale watching out of a quaint fishing village called Steveston to the bustle of the largest Asian night market in North America. We were never short on memorable moments. And if that's not enough, significant funding is available for both bid phase and booked event costs. Create your conference on the coast and head to visitrichmondbc.com for more information.
But thinking kind of for the theme of this episode, what are some common mistakes that you see event planners or event organizers make when they're starting to budget for AV, or maybe they've already budgeted for AV, and any tips on how to avoid repeating those mistakes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is really the place where we sit as a business, is really in that kind of crux of being a consultant for a lot of our clients. Even if we're simply just the AV company, there's a lot of consultancy that goes into how we produce and how we make a decision on a small or a large event. And so absolutely helping to make good decisions as the name of the game. I think number one, what I've seen, especially in this last year, is that assumptions are a killer. We used to know a lot of prices. We used to have a general idea about how long things were going to take, what the supply chain looked like, what this hotel cost versus that hotel. It's just not the case. And it's not an equal playing field either. So there's not a general inflation that happened within the events industry that we can count on formulaically and go out and say, all right, it's going to, AV should cost blank based on last year in this locale. You just don't have that formula anymore. So we just need to go out and get quotes. And that is the unfortunate biggest kind of bummer, because up against that is really the squeezed timelines. And I have probably been dealing with this much like everyone on listening in earshot, that the sub 90 and even some of the sub 30-day confirmation timelines are just the namesake of the entire pipeline. And so the idea that we can kind of just make keep our discounts today into tomorrow is just really not there. So I'd say this idea of like waiting to confirm costs, just be aware of your estimate expiration dates, and don't assume that additions later might be at the exact same price as you see in your line items. That being said, a big strategy is always to cut later rather than try to add things later. This is a strategy I impose with a lot of our clients. I say, Y'all, it is so much easier for me to cancel a line item in the last 30 days than it is to try to add any extra things. Availability is a true issue. And plus, we end up in a realm of conservative budgeting when we just do that. Big asterisk. Be aware of contract terms. Our company, we sign a contract, everything is variable outside of that 50% deposit. Basically, that's the only thing you're on the line for. Other contracts may end up, you sign the line items, that's what you're on the hook for. I would just make sure that you have that negotiation, but in general, it's easier to cut rather than try to add, and especially when it comes to the discounts. So I think all things lining up, the biggest differentiator is really, if possible, just design the event early. It's making these decisions at least 90 days out. That's where you can really capture all the discount. That's where you capture the efficiencies of scale, and that's where you have the ability for people to get back to you in a timely fashion. So those are the big ones, I'd say.
I think those are really important. And it is crazy. We were actually just having this conversation earlier today about how everybody wants something yesterday and it's like the quickest turnaround. Tony, I have done that to you before. So I'm like, I'm not pretending like it doesn't happen. It
No,
definitely
and there's no hate, really. Like, right? This is
yeah.
just like the
Yeah.
way that the industry is, and I think that as business people, we've kind of learned that we have to shift our own timelines, our own expectations, some of the protocols, and just to kind of shift for that scenario. But yeah, I mean, no problem to it. We just have to adjust for it.
Right. Yeah, those are good tips though for sure to keep in mind. And what are also some cost effective tips for small to mid-size events when they are working on their AV orders?
Totally. Yeah. I would say that even if you're doing a smaller mid-size event, even if it's a, rinse and repeat foundation, type of thing, I am a huge proponent of documentation and this idea that you can, create something one year, repurpose it into the future. I'm just going to go down a rabbit hole. If you're, I don't want to spend time on documentation type of person, go ahead and skip forward as you can imagine. But I would always say to compose an AV RFP. That's a request for proposal. And for two reasons. Number one, it kind of forces you as the client and as the producer to decide really on what you want in advance. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of on a paper say like, oh, well, if I want that, it's probably going to cost that. Okay, we can make some generalized napkin math decisions before we even start having a conversation. So forcing you to kind of get your ducks in a row. But then second of all, whenever you compose an RFP and you send over an RFP, even if it's a 2-page RFP, to an in-house vendor or a competing third-party vendor or any person you're trying to get a quote from, all of a sudden the onus is on everyone to show up with their best self, give the biggest discounts. We know we're competing against other people. I think the RFP process is just, it's a framework for your email that if you're just willing to kind of take the email content you would have put in and sent to Encore, you take that and you put it into an RFP format and you send it to Encore and let them know that they're competing against 5 other companies, they're going to give you a 50% discount. And I've seen it happen. I'm actually working on a program right now where it should have been a $600,000 quote out in West Palm Beach for an event in October. And they are now down to 280 with a 55% discount right off the bat, just because they know that they're talking to someone who is, and this is Encore. They've raised their prices 200% since last year.
It's insane. That was that was my other thing. Well, it's funny you say that, Tony, because on a episode that we released 2 weeks ago, I did my predictions from 2020, looking ahead for a year. And one of them is that more folks are going to shop around specifically their AV order more. So I know some people are already doing it, but it's going to become the norm just based on how kind of in-house has skyrocketed. Again, I have some aspirational predictions, but I'm starting to see more people being open to it. But I do, just to backtrack for your RFP, because I have some of my small clients that I work with. Do you think there's an advantage to actually calling it an RFP and having it as a Word doc versus like, I've done that, but it's in an email of like, and I say like, here's what I'm requesting a quote for, and I let them know I'm shopping it around, but it's just all in one email versus having like a separate attached document? Or is there a magical power of having like
That's a
official
really good
documentation?
question. That's a super good question. It's very subjective, I'd imagine. But from me personally, if I have an attachment that has letterhead, I stand up a little straighter than if I get an email that even has like super great formatting, has awesome deadlines, has everything outlined. I put it in the same folder, but the one that has like the little, paperclip pin on it in my email, I'm just like, ooh, got to get to that one. It's optics, but yeah, I think just simply having just even a one-page format, you take the same information, you pop it into a PDF, and you say, hey, here's the RFP that everyone else is getting. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's the thing, is once you get that attachment, you're like, ooh, who else in town probably got this? That's what I start thinking as a provider.
Yeah, and I just want our listeners to even understand, if you're not even at that level, just even making a list of what you want, like number of speakers, duration of like certain questions, because that's, if we're talking about cost effectiveness, these are like things that I've heard sometimes AV and production companies get in drips and drabs, and they have huge budget implications. Versus if you sit down and at least think through, it's 2 days from 9 to 5, we get to load in a day before, like just some of that. Even if you start where I have with some clients, which is just an email, I agree with Tony. I think having it formalized is great, but just even having something is going to help you, succeed with your AV quotes and getting them into, closer to what you actually want without actually getting like price gouged, versus them having throughout the process. Like you mentioned, Tony, it's easier to cut than to add. And I have found so many people get burned by the adding process
Oh yeah.
because they just didn't, the client or the event organizer just didn't share that information at the crucial, planning stage when you were first doing that quote.
Well, it's that scenario too, right? Where you talked about like having a schedule outlined in your RFP. Simply just by having that like as a necessary, you know, form to fill in, a box to check, you outline the evening reception that never ends up in the email that you would send over. And then all of a sudden, oh, we need a technician or a group of technicians for the evening reception. We're not going to charge you extra money for the gear, but like, wow, now that's a few $1,000 difference. Absolutely. That's a big one. I don't know. Have you ever been boned on on-site internet for attendee Wi-Fi as
Oh
well?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of things I would recommend about that line item. Number one, again, knowing going in what you need and how you can, work with that is big. So the RFP process, number one. But when you go on a site visit, I would, by all means, take out your cell phone, get the app Speed Test. It's by this company called Ookla, Ookla, or it's at speedtest.net, and just run that. It's basically a go button. It basically attaches to whatever Wi-Fi that you're on or your cellular signal. Best case scenario, what I do is I'm usually in a team of folks that I have T-Mobile. This person has AT&T. That person has Verizon. I just grab all the phones, and for about 5 minutes, I'm sitting there running speed tests. Because if you can get a speed test that's 30, 40 megabits up down connection on your cell phone, then, and you get that for all three major carriers, and you get that in a lot of different nooks and crannies of your event space, there is zero reason that you're going to need attendee Wi-Fi. There's just not, because you think about most of your attendees, they're savvy people who have laptops and phones, and they know that if they crack open their laptop that doesn't have, a cellular card in it, and they look and they don't have a public Wi-Fi, they're going to see their phone hotspot. And it's just, you just don't have to think about it too hard. Just check that cellular signals are good. If they are, tell your constituency, tell your client and their CEO and everyone else, cell signals are great. We're not buying attendee Wi-Fi. And that will, eliminate $10,000 to $30,000 off of the end bill sometimes.
I'm doing a speed test right now. I'm looking
Hey,
into it.
there it is.
Right when you were talking about Wi-Fi, I got a notification here on StreamYard that my Wi-Fi was lagging on my end. So here I am practicing in real time. Even
There
though
it
now
is,
that
right? And
there you go.
there's certain devices have different things
Yeah.
that they can, they respond differently. So it's always good to do that. But I'd say like attendee Wi-Fi, it becomes less and less of a concern unless you're literally in a bunker down below, or you're just out in the middle of in a very very remote type of location. So I'd say those are really really big pitfalls that that people fall in quite often when it comes to event planning.
Mhm.
I don't know why internet. I mean, I was at an event where they had some executives from Encore speaking about it, and a bunch of planners were upset with Wi-Fi, and they tried to rationalize the price and explain why it's so expensive. But it still was one. It was like, when we have these events, because I'm like, to counter that is like totally great for attendees, but I'm like, for any event that has a virtual component of any kind, you have to have hard lines, and especially I've
Absolutely.
just coming up with this for a breakouts. I had a client that wanted to save money, cut the Wi-Fi, talk to speakers, and they're like, no, yep, we're going to have you send slides ahead of time. It'll be PowerPoint. We download it. We put it on these laptops. You're going to be fine. And then the week of, we went through all of this because we had so many speakers who wanted to use, it was the organization that used Google Slides.
Oh yeah.
And they all insisted on using it last minute, and things were just so slow. Like, the access to the Wi-Fi they had then was so slow. Images weren't loading, videos weren't loading. And it was just one of those, like, post-event, you're going, if we had had just one hard line in each room,
Yeah,
how much
exactly.
of a headache this would have saved us. So I'm like,
That's a big thing, Logan. I think that there's a really big propensity for a lot of organizations, especially on the West Coast. Like, we're West, particularly. I'm a Seattle company. You both are West Coast based, and I think that there's a lot of Google users that especially a lot of our Bay Area clients. Everything, the entire organization is run on G Suite. Let alone, you try and ask for a PowerPoint, they're just like, a power what? Like, how dare you? And so this ecosystem of Google Slides. Absolutely. Like, I think that it's either you design it in one of two ways, right? Um, y'all can design all you want in Google Slides, but then we pay for a content media manager to translate all of that into PowerPoint so that we can operate it practically. Because PowerPoint is a much better practical software for practical audiovisual. And so you pay for the person to make sure that all the fonts are correct, everything looks all right, or you pay for the internet lines in every single one of those rooms, and you have like at least 15 to 20 megabit up and down, because people are going to be linking videos and other things like that, right? So you just need diehard internet. But I'd say one of those two ways, because content, what do they call them, roadblocks, where you're bottlenecked with content in the last week prior to the event. It happens far too often, and that is a cost of mood that is the silent killer to your event. If your technicians kind of don't care 100%, there's a lot that can go wrong. Even that 1 percentile, right? So you just want to keep the whole thing as on its feet as possible. I think everyone happy.
Those are some really great tips. And from the event planner or producer perspective, what are some strategies that they can use for negotiating with AV vendors like yourself to get the best rates without sacrificing quality, and any other ways that you haven't identified?
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, first off, just be blunt about it. Ask for discounts. I mean, like, do you offer a nonprofit, education, community service? What other discounts do you offer? That's a good question. I don't get. But like, okay, let me tell you about my discount program. Like, and that's right off the bat. The power of the ask, I think, is a big one. A lot of it, so much of it comes back to just making sure that the vendors know they're competing against each other. I have the benefit of being both an AV company, and we respond to RFPs all the time, but I'm also a production manager, and we compose the RFPs and go to locales and have vendors compete against them. So I have this benefit of being on both sides of it. And I'm just saying, like, that kind of onus on the vendor is good from both sides. And what that does is it just really it makes people, like I said, straighten up a little bit, show up at their best self. Instead of sending you a line item quote from their order system, they put together a slide deck because you put together a PDF, right? And it's these little things that I think that we see incrementally better responses and much better rates, better quality responses when we are we have vendors that are competing against each other and they know it. That's really the biggest one. But then I'll put one caveat on there. As a professional and as an organization, we are both an AV company and a production management consultancy. So I know that it may not be a very common thing in the industry, but we have a couple of clients where we literally are just a liaison to come in and write an RFP and make Encore quick in their boots, just to get them to go down in their price, because we know we're not going to use a third party, even if a third party be better. The client brings us in simply to pay us X amount just to get Encore 50% off. And I mean, if you need a coach, a translator, or a captain for a production department, hiring a production manager is a very wise investment.
I feel like I wear that hat for a lot of my smaller clients and my nonprofits, because I get very passionate about people taking other people for a ride because they don't know what they don't know. Because I also am a big advocate of we should be paying people, well, fair. It's long hours, it's hard work. These are skilled workers, but there is a balance to me where, yes, I think that competition is healthy. I do. This is Tony. This just came to me while we were talking. How do you feel? Because you see both sides. How do you feel about an event client coming to you revealing what their budget is for a project versus somebody who doesn't tell you the budget and just wants you to come, but can tell you what they think they need,
Oh my
which is
gosh.
more helpful?
Every single time, reveal to me a budget, reveal to me a range, give me whatever information. And I'll caveat this on most of my kickoff calls. It's actually in our template for our agenda for our kickoff calls. Tell me about your budget. Do you have a range? We can design your show one of two ways. I can design it based on vision. Oftentimes we end up blowing out a lot of extra expenses. Or I can design it within a framework of your budget. And we're not going to compromise anything. It's just going to be closer to reality. It's going to be closer to you being able to say yes. And every time, that's also part of the RFP process. If you can define a budget and go into an ask with a vendor with that in mind, always disclose it, always and every time.
I think that makes a lot of sense, obviously. Sometimes even like I think we all experience it as vendors in one capacity. It is hard sometimes to get that information out of people, but only helpful, honestly. So makes so
And
much
you
You know
sense.
your vendors, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you know your vendors are always going to like go a little bit more than your budget anyway. So just tell them the number in advance,
Mhm.
I mean,
Well, I think it's funny too. The other way is like depending, because people are like, "Oh, I don't want to tell them too much," and I was like, "Yeah, but like they're gonna find something to fill whatever it is you have, and then yes, you can cut things down if it truly you don't need it." But like, I mean, I have seen funny quotes that are like 120,000, and then the client's like, "I only have 90,000," and all of a sudden the budget magically comes down to 90 with like very minimal changes, and it's like, where did this? It's just
it's
one of
in
those
the
numbers like,
margins.
where did it come from?
Absolutely, absolutely. And really, for us, I mean, oftentimes it allows us to really just um make the right decisions. I mean, like we now know what the scale of your show is, because when I hear about a show and it's like, okay, I hear you're gonna have like an elephant and lasers and all this stuff, it's like $1 million show. And you say you have $500,000, say, all right, how do we get elephants and lasers within $500,000? And we produce a solution. It's like but it's, if I was assuming elephants and lasers for $10,000 and you said it's only 500,000, oh wow, now as a company I'm going to go, well, I better fill that $500,000 bucket. You're going to get the right response. Like the bottom feeders are going to give you like a kind of slippery response. The top feeders are going to give you a proper response. Yeah, disclose it always.
So helpful. I mean, Tony, I think we've got lots of little nuggets in here for our listeners, but is there anything else that you wish event planners or event organizers knew about AV and event production?
We love coffee. I wrote a VIP email, like honestly, about the power of crew coffee. And there was an event where we just spent 6 days, and that was one of the budget items that got removed. And I found out the morning of the event, like there's 40 people being like, "Yo, okay, it's a coffee break. Where's the coffee?" It was like almost a walkout scenario. I'm not joking. Crew coffee. It's it's a silly thing. Don't mess with the crew coffee.
Oh God, should be watched on YouTube. My face when Tony just said that.
It's true, right?
It's
Oh,
just
it
the
is.
little things. It's the little things, right?
It's
It's the
and to me
littlest ones, right?
of all the budget items, of all the line items, and like maybe it's not even the AV budget, but on like when you're thinking about your food and beverage for your entire event, if you're telling me that these people you're asking to work 12, 16-hour days that have important things that everybody would notice, you don't want to caffeinate them. Whereas we've talked to some other folks in the industry, hydrate them. I've heard from somebody who said they weren't provided water on site. Just Mary,
Yep.
we can get on our soapbox the whole other episode about feeding crew.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, right? Yeah, like that's a great caveat for next time.
Yeah.
gosh.
Definitely. Well, Tony, this has been awesome. There have been so many tips and tricks in here, and I know that I've learned stuff, and it's just been great. So we hope our listeners have, of course, as well. So before we let you go, anything else you want to add, or can you let listeners know where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So I do a VIP email. I kind of mentioned that it's about a weekly type of thing, and you can find that online at techeventpro.com/VIP. And otherwise, we are pretty much everywhere all over the place. So if you're looking for, like I said, just a sounding board or possibly a vendor, find us Tech Event Pro, whether it's X, Instagram, Facebook, wherever else, or .com.
Thank you so much, Tony. We appreciate you being here.
You got it. Thank you both as well. Appreciate you, Mary and Logan.
Thanks,
And
Tony.
Mary, I have the bonus tip this
You
week.
do? Okay, share it with us, Logan. I'm so excited.
So this one is about Zoom Webinar, and I'm specifically talking about Zoom Webinar, the software, not just a webinar that you do in Zoom, because there's Zoom Meeting and Zoom Webinar. But in Zoom Webinar, I would encourage you to always have your practice session enabled. This is something that it like essentially creates a closed door situation like you would in person, where you close your doors and you have your tech team and your speakers and you're all prepping, making sure you're ready to go before you open the doors and your attendees are allowed in. This is super helpful just to make sure everyone's buttoned up. You can hear everybody, you can see everybody. But my caveat is, once you're in the practice session, you're going to see a button that says Start Webinar. Make sure you, as the host, and anyone else who's a co-host, not a speaker, but a co-host, knows not to hit that button, Start Webinar, until you're ready to start. I had a consulting client that we walked through this multiple times. She was a little stressed out about it. And I just wanted to make sure everybody here knows the minute you hit Start Webinar, everyone can see and hear you, just like you opened your doors in person. So I always just find that's a best practice for me, is always have practice session enabled and use that as your own little prep meeting space before you're ready to get into your webinar.
Logan, I love that you're still throwing down with the Zoom tips. This is great.
It will
It's
never
still
die.
relevant. It is. It is. Logan has some really great videos on her YouTube about Zoom. So be sure to check those out if that interests you and you'd like more. But Logan, that is a great and true bonus tip. So thanks so much for sharing that today. And thank you everyone for listening to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Better Events Pod. Don't forget to check out our private community if you haven't yet. We have information in the show notes, but we're on Substack and we have lots of fun things going on. We'd love to see you over there. You can also email us at bettereventspod@gmail.com. And we thank you so much for listening to another week of the episode, and we will see you again next Wednesday.